Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Amkraut, the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegal Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural lecture in our series with the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. Today's session will be a conversation with Professor DEBORAH Dash Moore, and she will give some introduction as well about the Posen Library. But first, a few words about Professor Moore. She is editor-in-chief of the Posen Library and is the Frederick G. Huetwell Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Her work focuses on American Jews in the modern era. She arrived at the University of Michigan in 2005 and served as director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for a decade. During those years, she also engaged in scholarly projects focused on New York City, specifically a 3-volume award-winning history of New York Jews' City of Promises. Most recently, she has published a synthesis of those 3 volumes, Jewish New York, The Remarkable Story of the City and a People. In April 2018, her earlier book, GI Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, formed the basis for a documentary on Jewish GIs shown on PBS, GI Jews, Jewish Americans in World War II. Her current work focuses on Jewish American photographers of New York City. She's always been known to me as one of the country's leading scholars of American Jewry, so it's my honor to share the virtual stage with her today. Please welcome Professor DEBORAH Dash Moore.
So, Brian, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I do want to say a couple of words about the Posen Library, and I am going to try to share my screen. Let's hope that this works. So let's see how that goes. We'll try this share here. Yeah, okay, so now you have an image, I hope, of the volume 10 of the Posen Library. I just want to give people a sense of what was involved in creating the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. It would have been a relatively easy task to edit a volume if this were going to be just another collection of the greatest hits of the Jewish past. But to create an anthology that brought sacred and secular together, that understood Jewish to refer to women as well as men, that included expressions of Jewish civilization from around the globe, since Jews were and are a global diasporic people, that made accessible knowledge previously restricted to those who could read many languages. To assemble such an anthology was unprecedented. And it took not quite a village, but a spirit of willing collaboration and a sharing of expertise from scholars, translators, permissions experts, researchers who work together to make this happen. The Posen Library requires just this type of cooperative scholarship because it is no standard anthology of Jewish culture and civilization. Rather, I think it's best to think of it as an imaginative reclamation and reconstruction of complicated Jewish worlds that flourished in the past. Volume 10, which covers the last decades of the 20th century and extends actually into the 21st, 2005, would not have been published without the extraordinary work of my co-editor, Nurith Gertz, who brought great knowledge of Israeli culture to our partnership on the volume. And in addition, I would really be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the phenomenal contribution of Rachel Weinstein, who worked with me and Nurith on this volume and has since become the managing editor of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. So I think that's an intro to the Posen Library. I will stop sharing. We'll come back to this when we get to talk about some actual images and stuff.
So we're going to be ready to jump in. Just a quick comment to everyone out there. We're running this Zoom in what we call webinar style. If you do have questions for DEBORAH, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will either sort of bring them in stream of consciousness if they're connected to the topic we're talking about, or certainly we'll have time for formal Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please avail yourself of that Q&A. You can use the chat function if you really want to communicate with one another, but you know, for actual questions for the talk, we encourage you to use the Q&A. So Deborah, the final volume, the final decades of a volume on Jewish culture and civilization, you're beginning it with the year 1973. And, you know, for those of us that study Jewish history, most of us think of 1967 as a particular turning point if you're going to look at this in sort of post-war, immediate post-war era. So why begin with 1973?
So that's a great question. And, you know, as a historian, one loves to disrupt a bit some of the standard periodization. And just to sort of be obvious, but 1967 is followed by 1968, which is to say, after the Six-Day War of 67 and 68, you have the student uprisings, you have these protests against Vietnam, you have ongoing agitation for change. And that continues really until, I would say, basically the fall of 1973. Because in the fall of 1973, you know, you have the Yom Kippur War, you have Watergate, you have on September 11th, the assassination of Salvador Allende, which really marks the end of a kind of socialist leadership in South America. And this begins something different, right? And so I think, and my co-editor Nurith Gertz agreed, that 73 marks a real turning point. And just to sort of argue a little further for that point, consider some of the literature that's published in 1973. So the first selection in this volume comes from Erica Young's Fear of Flying. Wow, this was, you know, a very provocative book by a feminist writer. It indicates changes that are going to come. Also, poetry that comes out in 73. If you look to the poetry section, there's the American Jewish poet Samuel Menashe. We include his poem Manna, which begins, "Open your mouth to feed that flesh." And it's followed by an Israeli Jewish poet, Meir Wieseltier's Moving Lights, that begins, I'm going to just read a couple of lines. "At the close of Independence Day, 1972, a biplane rose in the Tel Aviv sky at dusk, and on its belly, moving lights flashed. For health and pleasure, eat plenty of poultry. Eat as you should with deli chicken goods." It goes on. 1973 sees young adult literature, which is a category of literature that we include as part of Jewish culture, and sort of the beginnings of a kind of Holocaust consciousness, a book by Yuri Sewell called Uncle Misha's Partisans, right, on the partisan movement. And in intellectual culture in 1973, you have Charles Liebman's very powerful and insightful analysis of a book he called The Ambivalent American Jew. Right? And we took a selection from that book called Integration and Survival, which addresses key themes in Liebman's analysis. And I'll just give you a taste of it. He writes, "Jewish parents will raise strong objections if their son informs them that he is marrying a non-Jewish girl," he writes. "But if the son adds that his girlfriend's parents also object to the marriage, the Jewish parents will either be outraged by their anti-Semitism or else fail to understand what basis they have for raising objections." So you can see, I think, how a new era here is being introduced, which is very different from the previous decades and will continue to be. I don't know, did I convince you?
Yeah, and I would, just to build on that a little bit, it's sort of like one could easily say the 60s bleed into the 70s. And so you can't really have that, that hard, fast, end. And, I would ask you, when you talk about sort of entering a new era, you're looking at the, the generation that was raised really in this post-war era, now finally coming of age, and the next generation emerging, sort of like this is where the boomers are starting to really move in.
Yes, I think that's correct. So I think as a generational concept, it also makes sense to think about 1973 as that transition, because people who were born in the, right after World War II, which is usually when, the boomers are understood, are adults, they've finished their education, unless they've gone on, for a medical degree or something like that. And yeah, they're going to be setting the tone in the future. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how this will manifest in visual culture?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen again. Let's see if I can do that. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, so here's a photograph called Shadow in Synagogue by author Tress that he made in 1974. And Tress is known for somewhat homoerotic photographs. And I think in this case, he brings that sensibility to the Ten Commandments, right? Where the hand is reaching up. And you also see some of his face, the eyeglasses. I don't know if you can see eyeglasses, and he's wearing tefillin, right? In this. So this is a very different sensibility. You wouldn't find this in an earlier time period. Similarly, you get this work, Drucksland, called by Michael Drucks, who's an Israeli a conceptual artist. And you can see what he's doing here. I mean, it's interesting that he's using English, but he's thinking about what are these, he calls them occupied territories in this image. What does that mean that it's up there on the forehead? How is he trying to imagine Israel? So political art in a different way is emerging. Another example here is from South Africa, right? This is David Goldblatt, a very well-known photographer, and he gives a little dialogue here. She said to him, "You be the driver and I'll be the madam." And they picked up the fender and posed. Right? And Hillbrow is where he took the picture. So, I mean, this is a picture about apartheid. It's about class. It's about the world in which Goldblatt lives. Goldblatt took photographs of Blacks in South Africa. He took photographs of wealthy Afrikaners. He spanned the spectrum, but he took particularly, I think, sympathetic images of Blacks here, and trying to let them, in a sense, present themselves and also comment on their situation. And finally, another photograph, and we do include, I must admit, quite a few photographs in this volume, because photography is recognized as emerging as an art form in these years. And this is called The Eyes of the Nation by Michael Naumann. It's a sign, and if you look further back, there's the same sign here. And it is a political photograph. It doesn't indicate what this fence is, and this broken down fence, but once it suggests a kind of border and what's going to happen, right, on the other side, we might say, of what later becomes known as the Green Line. So I think these give you a very good sense of some of the visual changes and that are taking place here.
One thing about that sort of sign that's in the photograph, and interesting, the eyes of the nation. Obviously, we use the phrase "the eyes of the world are watching" quite often, and in this case, the artist, takes is obviously focusing on a different message, and obviously, you're moving into the political realm with that image. So, can you talk a little bit about some of the new forms of Jewish politics that are coming about? So we talked a little bit about 1973 as a turning point in terms of Israeli politics in particular. Of course, it's 1977, which one could link back to 1973, but certainly 1977, the election of Menachem Begin, that is an important turning point. So how do we see that finding its way into the cultural realm?
Well, you're right to emphasize that in terms of the Israeli history, that the 73 and 77 are definitely related. And, Begin's party, initially Herut, then Likud, was always in the opposition. And it seemed like it would never gain any power. And then suddenly in 77, it does gain power. And that's a major shift because it's a peaceful transition of power. Israel has been in existence as a state since 48, and this is the first real transition that occurs. It also means that those who are who saw themselves as the leaders and the majority were connected to Mapai and the Labor Party, now have to recognize themselves as a minority. And that too is a very unusual thing. I wanted to pull something from David Avidan, who's an Israeli poet, an essayist, a film writer. We include his mandatory high school class mandatory high school class of 1973 poem. Yeah, okay. And I just want to do the first sentence of each of the 5 stanzas, okay, which begins with graduation. A young man graduates and heads off to get damaged. A young man graduates and heads off to get injured. A young man graduates and heads off not to come back. A young man graduates and heads to be finished off. A young man graduates, returned in a box. This is really very, very new, right? Because, of course, all Israeli secular youngsters graduated high school and went into the military. And it really marks the beginning of a reckoning of the social costs of war. It's important, he calls it the class of 73, because it would be the Yom Kippur War, which led to so many deaths. And this is appearing even as Begin succeeds in signing peace treaty with Egypt, right? Which is a major accomplishment.
I hear the words of that poem, and obviously the way it's framed, I know you're talking about Israel and Yom Kippur War, the resonance of Vietnam to an American audience right around the same time. Right. It's palpable.
Yeah.
What do you think about some other?
Also, let me just interrupt here. Of course, what ends up happening in the U.S. in the late 70s is the elimination of the draft. And that really puts American Jews and Israeli Jews on a different track because military service had been something that had been characteristic, at least for men in the United States, including Jewish men. And it was a connection with Israelis. But That's an important change here. Yeah.
Absolutely. So if we stick with the same era, 73 to 77, what other new distinctive cultural movements are we seeing emerging at this time?
Well, I think that there are really sort of two major movements that emerge in the 70s and of course continue. One of them is Holocaust consciousness. It was there before, but it was there in a different way. So you have Holocaust, the made-for-TV movie, and so that term itself now achieves dominance. Before that movie, there were a number of different words that were used to talk about the murder of European Jews by the Nazis. But by 78, with the TV movie Holocaust, it becomes a key term. And the second thing that's really, I think, crucial is, of course, the rise of Jewish feminism. So let me go back to sharing my screen, because I think there's some lovely visuals that reflect the sort of presence of a kind of Holocaust consciousness in art. This is by Mindy, who is a child of survivors. She has the distinction of being the first baby born in Bergen-Belsen, but when it was a DP camp, right, for displaced persons, after it had previously been a concentration camp. And it's called Lost Flowers, and it's a way of remembering those who were not around anymore. And you can see, I believe here, make out it says Shema, right? So she's here. She's evoking the oral dimension too. And then there's this very powerful installation by Alain Kirilli, and his biography is also sort of typical of what's happening in this period. He's born in Paris, but then he comes to the US, and he draws upon European and also non-Western art. And in this installation, Commandment, he made it from it's out of forged iron. It's originally from Torah decorations, right? And I think it's truly a wonderful installation. He did a number of different versions of it there, but you can see the way in which he's reimagining Commandment through these forged iron illustrations. And then there's feminism, and but not just American feminism. There's Jewish feminism, right? That emerges in this period, starting in the early 70s. You get rabbis, women rabbis, who are ordained in the Reform movement, in the Reconstructionist movement, and you also get the beginnings of theological ideas articulated by women, and you get new rituals. The notion of Rosh Chodesh, making this into a women's holiday, it appears. And one of my favorites, which is in the volume, is from, oops, wrong way here, from Judith Plaskow. And here, this is her midrash, right? So it's inviting women to do something that Jewish men have done for a long time, which is write midrash and interpretation. And it's called The Coming of Lilith. And she posits, because there are two versions, and we know we just read the Parsha last week, right? The beginning of Breshit. There are two versions of the creation story. And she postulates that in the first version, Lilith was created, but Lilith leaves the garden, which leads to the need to create Eve, right? And Adam has told Lilith, Eve, all kinds of horrible stories about Lilith, right? I mean, okay. But after many, then she writes, one day, after many months of strange and disturbing thoughts, Eve, wandering around the garden, noticed a young apple tree she and Adam had planted and saw that one of its branches reached over the garden wall. Spontaneously, she tried to climb it and, struggling to the top, swung herself over the wall. She did not wander long on the other side before she met the one she had come to find, for Lilith was waiting. At first sight of her, Eve remembered the tales of Adam and was frightened. But Lilith smiled and greeted her kindly. "Who are you?" they asked each other. "What is your story?" And they sat and spoke together of the past and then of the future. They talked for many hours, not once, but many times. They taught each other many things and told each other stories and laughed together and cried over and over till the bond of sisterhood grew between them. Meanwhile, back in the garden, Adam was puzzled about Eve's comings and goings and disturbed by what he sensed to be her new attitude toward him. He talked to God about it, and God, having his own problems with Adam and a somewhat broader perspective, was able to help out a little, but he was confused too. Something had failed to go according to plan. As in the days of Abraham, he needed counsel from his children. "I am who I am," thought God, "but I must become who I will become." So I'm going to stop sharing there. Yeah.
I love that last piece in its own way, just that last sentence. And I know, like, this is really dating myself, but it makes me think of, like, free to be you and me, right? You will be, and that's, you know, part of the movement that you're talking about, that you can become who you will become. And then putting that in God's mouth as well.
Right, that's right. Yes.
Really speaks to the era. So you're moving us, you know, into the written word. And, you know, in addition to all the visuals that you've been giving us, of course, these decades have seen some exceptional recognition of Jewish writers. Obviously, we can look at the Nobel prizes, including this year, Louise Gluck.
That's right.
But you know, if we have this correctly, we're looking at two Jewish writers who won the Nobel Prize each decade from 73 to 2005. So can you talk a little bit about those prize winners and what that tells us about Jewish culture during these decades?
So yeah, it's really very impressive. You had it almost right, because there's one decade when you don't have two.
Nope.
But just to run through those prize winners: Saul Bellow in 76 and Isaac Bashevis Singer in 78. Elias Canetti in 81, Joseph Brodsky in 87. Nadine Gordimer, 91, the only one just one. Imre Kertész in 2002, then Harold Pinter in 2005. And of course, we have Bob Dylan and Louise Gluck, who are, you know, the most recent ones. What I'd love people to sort of think about when you think of these Jewish Nobel Prize winners, is the diversity of languages represented here, as well as countries. You know, you have English from the United States and English from South Africa and English from Great Britain, right? And then you have English via Russia and the Soviet Union. You have Yiddish, right, via Poland, but in the US. You have Hungarian, but in Germany. And then you have German via Bulgaria, England, Vienna, and back to England, which is Canetti. I think that these Nobel Prize winners let us understand the global reach of Jewish culture. And also, I should emphasize the power of translation, because their work is being translated. It's not all in English. It's reaching a large audience that way. And I mean, just, you know, all right. So I want to share, if it's okay with you, a couple of things from that are among my favorites. Okay, go back to my screen share again, and so So Nadine, oopsie, oh God, okay. Nadine Gordimer, who's a South African Jewish writer, recounts in her Nobel speech, a part of it. She says, when the 6-year-old daughter of a friend of mine overheard her father telling someone that I had been awarded the Nobel Prize, she asked whether I had received it before, right? And he replied that the prize was something you could only get once. Whereupon the small girl thought for a moment. Oh, she said, so it's like the chicken pox. Okay. And then she goes on to talk a bit about the difficulties of writing in apartheid South Africa. Right? It took the realization that the color bar, I use that old concrete image of racism, was like the gate of the law in Kafka's parable, which was closed to the supplicant throughout his life because he didn't understand that only he could open it. It took this to make us realize that what we had to do to find the world was to enter our own fully first. We had to enter through the tragedy of our own particular place. And I think that, you know, Gordimer's citing of Kafka is one of those examples that show the continuities within Jewish culture, right? It's not just about disruption. And her reading Kafka into apartheid and the tragedy of South Africa there. So another one of my favorites, I guess, is from Imre Kertész, and this is a relatively long selection. I don't know if we're running out of time or not.
I think we're doing okay.
We're okay? Okay. So he's Hungarian. He spoke in German, however. And he writes about the Holocaust. Today, we are experiencing a globalization and inflation of the Holocaust. Remember, this is 2002. The Holocaust survivor who knows Auschwitz through the experience of suffering observes it all from the perspective assigned to him. He keeps silent or gives interviews to the Spielberg Foundation. He accepts the compensation payments promised him after a 50-year delay. Or if he is prominent, he makes a speech in the Swedish Academy. And he asks the question, what is he bequeathing? What is his spiritual legacy? Has he enriched human knowledge with his tale of suffering? Or has he only borne witness to the unimaginable degradation of the human being, in which there is no lesson, and which ought to be forgotten as quickly as possible? I do not see it that way. I have not changed my opinion that the Holocaust is a trauma of European civilization, and it is becoming a life and death matter, whether this trauma lives on as culture or neurosis, in a constructive or destructive form in European societies. Finally, I have never tried to see the complex of problems referred to as the Holocaust merely as the unsolvable conflict between Germans and Jews. I never believed that it was the latest chapter in the history of Jewish suffering, which followed logically from their earlier trials and tribulations. I never saw it as a one-time aberration, a large-scale pogrom, a precondition for the creation of Israel. What I discovered in Auschwitz is the human condition, the endpoint of a great adventure, where the European traveler arrived after his 2,000-year-old moral and cultural history. Right? So, you know, I think here you get a very powerful reflection, right, on the Holocaust from a survivor. And within the volume here, we don't have the Nobel Prize sleeves. We have a selection from Kaddish for a Child Not Born, which is one of a trilogy of novels that he writes. And this is very moving. He writes, later on, when my Jewishness gradually began to assume more importance, that is to say, when the news began to spread that that condition usually carries the death penalty, probably simply so I could grasp this incomprehensible and strange fact, that is, my being a Jew in its appropriately strange, yet at least more familiar light, then suddenly I found myself, then I suddenly found myself understanding who I was, a bald woman in a red gown in front of a mirror. This was a clear thing, even if it wasn't pleasant, and most of all, incomprehensible. Yet in the final analysis, my recognition gave definition to my unpleasant and rare, incomprehensible situation, explained, I'd almost say, where I belonged. So it's a reference to the fact that he walks in on his aunt and sees her, you know, in a red dressing gown. She's married, obviously, and has shaved her head. I'll stop my sharing here. So,
quick question, Deborah. On
yeah.
if you think about Kertész's speech at the award ceremony, sort of even in a way the universalization, right, of the Holocaust. He's sort of giving away Jewish ownership. Not that not that it's his to give away, but
right.
And that is, I think, part of the era also. That we're moving into. For whatever critiques emerge in terms of, the Hollywoodization and other things of the Holocaust, it's also the universalization and it becoming everyone's story. And then you have this tension, between the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world around the Holocaust. And I think one that goes on. I'd like to start to
really
move us a little bit farther ahead chronologically, picking up on this Holocaust theme. There was a bit of a sort of an affair, a cause célèbre, for those of us who follow these things, with the Deborah Lipstadt trial in 2005, after David Irving accused her of libel for calling him a Holocaust denier. How does that whole story and everything related to it tie into these cultural changes?
Yeah, I mean, it does relate to what we're talking about, because in the 90s, she publishes a book about denial of the Holocaust, right? So universalization is one move, but denial is the other. And one of the things that's really, I think, crucial, and I'm just going to share my screen again, if I may, to get to Deborah Lipstadt. Wait, where did it go? Here we go. Okay. Is you get in this period as well the building of monuments, that kind of physical space that is an argument against denial, right? So the museum, the Berlin Jewish Museum, that incorporates the Holocaust, this memorial in Vienna by Rachel Whiteread, which is a kind of non-library that references the burning of books and stuff. And of course, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. So Lipstadt then goes on trial in the 90s and writes the book about this libel trial, in which she has to prove the accuracy of what she said. It's sort of a reverse from the US. And this section is among the last things that we include in the volume, because it's from 2008. And she writes that, there were also some British Jews who worried about my staging a strong defense. I was particularly upset, Lipstadt's writing, when a prominent Jewish lawyer in London declared, "Settle, you might have to pass on getting Irving to admit that there are gas chambers, but that would be worth avoiding a trial." Unable to fathom signing a statement that passed on the gas chambers, I was about to ask what he thought should be my bottom line. 4 million Jews murdered? 3 million? One set of gas chambers? 2? Before I could formulate the words, Anthony, her lawyer, interceded. "We will not negotiate with an anti-Semite on historical truth." I said nothing, but felt exceptionally well represented. Anti-Semites, irrespective of their standing in the broader world, were scoundrels, and with scoundrels, one does not compromise. And, you know, Deborah Lipstadt has been, I think, you know, one of the most articulate writers about the Holocaust. She subsequently published a book on that. Her most recent book deals with anti-Semitism. She wrote about the Eichmann trial. Here, she's really getting at, you don't compromise with scoundrels on this. And the trial was crucial. She won, which was also crucial there.
So I want to remind everyone, please feel free to start putting some questions in the Q&A as we're getting towards the end of the formal presentation. But you know, obviously, you know, that was 2005. We're now sort of 15 years past that. So, you know, just some reflections that you could share, some enduring dimensions of Jewish culture from the end of the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st.
So one of the things that the increasing prominence of the Holocaust allowed for is the decision on the part of Jews to use it to identify other forms of genocide. And we have in the volume, for example, a call to action on Darfur, which was issued by David Harris and Ruth Messinger, that published in 2005. And a section of it reads, "Our collective memory of persecution and genocide evokes deep empathy for the victimized people of Darfur and keen recognition of our responsibility as Jews, as Americans, as people of conscience to aid them. Bitter history has taught us that indifference must never be the response to genocide." And so I think that, you know, with such a statement, you're getting into where we are today, right? I mean, this willingness to try to learn from the Holocaust and its bitter history, that indifference must never be the response, right? Just like Lipstadt said, you don't make agreements with scoundrels. But more generally, where are we today? So we've got some, I just want to end with some visuals, some wonderful, diverse examples. This one is Tikkun Ha'olam, part of Siona Benjamin's Finding Home series. So she's someone who comes out of India, eventually makes her way to New York City, and she uses Persian motifs, she uses Indian motifs, she draws upon Byzantine iconography as well as Jewish, to create really imaginative and different forms of Jewish culture here. You also have this Joshua Glotman piece. He's an activist in Israeli-Palestinian rapprochement within Israel itself. And it's an effort to memorialize another tragedy, right? The last village, Mukhtar. And you notice he has it in two languages here. This grows out of his work as a teacher as well as an artist. So that's another strain that I think is really interesting here. Very different, and yet with elements that I think are shared. Is this The Only Corner by Murki Yaquer, who comes out of Peru. And the highlands of Peru. He now lives in Lima, but also some in New York. And here's a very different texture and feel to think about. This too is part of Jewish culture today. And finally, the last one, which is one of my favorites, Walking in Russia by Vida Simon. She's Canadian, and this is an installation piece. The shoes, the sketches, the triangle of light coming through evokes, it seems to me, the dispersions, the migrations, but also the ways in which Jews have adopted, you know, the March of the Living, going back to Europe, and bringing the idea of walking in the other's shoes into a kind of literalness, as well as an abstractness in this installation.
So before we start moving into the questions, and we're starting to get some good questions in from the audience, I wanted to sort of, you know, can we connect the end of this talk to where you started? You know, if you look at the 70s as welcoming in, ushering in a new generation and a new cultural shift that happens along with that, how would you characterize a generational shift that we're maybe seeing really towards the end 20th and now into the 21st century, and then maybe where does this go with this next generation? You know, you see them on campus, so you know who they are.
Yes, it is a generational shift, right? I mean, these are not just the kids, they're the grandkids of baby boomers at this point. And they've grown up in a world that has always had an Israel, for example. I will tell you that as someone who teaches American Jewish history, for my students, the 20th century is a closed book. Right? It could be 500 years ago. And the fact that I can remember things, you could remember things, right? I mean, that we can remember things that happened in the 20th century is sort of astonishing to them, because they have no memory of the 20th century. And so it is history, and their world is the 21st century. And they're trying to figure out what does it mean to be Jewish in the 21st century, which is a very different and more complicated space than those years from 73 that marked the coming of age of their grandparents to where they are today. You know, it's a little hard to anticipate, but among the things, you know, that we've actually thought about doing with the Posen Library, not that we have, but is a greater recognition of Jews of color, for example. That wasn't even a term that existed back then. There were such Jews, but they didn't, you know, it wasn't part of our language. Jews of choice had entered the language, but not Jews of color. So the diversity of Jews, which previously was based on diaspora and where they lived, South Africa, you know, the Siona Benjamin, India, etc., now is a diversity within relatively few spaces, right, where Jews live, and most especially the U.S. and Israel. These are places.
So that diversity geographically is now, I wouldn't say being replaced, but being you know, maybe augmented by diversity of identity when you talk about Jews of color, and then you get into you know, other patterns of identity both in America and elsewhere.
Right. Yes, I would say that's definitely true. And a consciousness of it is occurring now, which wasn't true. I mean, you know, the feminism, Jewish feminism, you know, included lesbians and it included gays, but you did not have those people saying, oh, you know, we want to be rabbis too, right? And we want to be leaders. We have something really to offer, and that has occurred especially in the 21st century. We've got one or two pieces, you know, in this volume, but the visibility of diverse ways of being Jewish is really amazing.
So I imagine we will see that culture, you know, that emerge in the more formal cultural, you know, genres as we move forward. So, you know, one question that ties directly to, you know, earlier part of the conversation and looking into the 1970s, do you see an interrelation between peace in the 1970s and the rise of feminism in general and Jewish feminism?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, it's difficult to talk about peace, to be honest, because there seems to be wars going on all the time. You know, in the US, it was Vietnam. In Israel, there were, you know, the Yom Kippur War, and then you had the first Lebanon War in '81, and you know, it's so peace seems to be always something that people are seeking. I think if there had been real peace, it certainly would have encouraged the feminist movement. I mean, as someone who participated in it, I can recall debates, this especially in the 80s in Israel, when the women's movement got started there, about how legitimate is it to bring women's concerns to the forefront when peace is the most important concern, right? Does it matter that women are required to retire earlier than men, for example? You know, a very, you know, not earth-shattering difference, but a difference nonetheless between men and women in Israel. So it was really hard to think what would it be if you really did have peace, right? How that would relate to the feminist movement. It's a great question. It's a great question.
Another question that came in, and I guess, you know, this is a question for the volume, you know, as much as maybe your reflections on it. Where does the story of Soviet Jewry fit in, particularly in the era beginning in the 70s, where we know in the United States, this was a big deal, and then subsequently the movement into Israel?
Right. So we, of course, have a lot of excerpts from various Soviet Jewish writers in here. We have examples about of Soviet Jewish artists who do their form of political art. I mean, I will say that some of what I showed you is constrained by permissions, you know, what you're allowed to show. And so I didn't get permission to show some of that Soviet Jewish art, which sort of skewered things. But there's also, of course, political activism. So there's the whole section in volume 10 on what's called intellectual culture. The Liebman comes out of that section, but there's a substantial discussion in there of politics and intellectual questions about Soviet Jewry. So, for example, Elie Wiesel's pieces on Soviet Jews, and he writes something called The Jews of Silence, which is a little earlier, but he returns to the subject of Soviet Jews and the ways in which his visits to the Soviet Union inspired him, and uses it to say, American Jews, where are you, right? These people are really, you know, fighting for Jewishness, and you know, you go on a couple of marches and you think that that's enough. Yeah.
You know, related question that I would add, really as a question to you, this isn't a comment, like how does the Cold War and then the end of the Cold War really fit into how Jewish culture, particularly in America, but also in Israel, you know, moved on, you know, evolved, and you know, you talk about the Soviet Jewry movement, that is part and parcel of the Cold War.
Yep. Yep, that's correct. Well, I went sort of quickly through some of those memorials, but you would not have had those memorials built in Berlin, especially the Berlin ones, if you hadn't had the end of the Cold War. You needed that wall to come down in '89. You needed the Soviet Union to end, and for Germany to be reunited, and thus as a not just a West Germany and an East Germany, but to actually a Germany to begin to come to grips with its own history that way. I think with the Cold War, you also, the end of it in the US led American Jews to look for another political issue, right, that would mobilize people in the same way. So, the continuity crisis was one of those political issues that hopefully would draw connections among American and diverse American Jews, right? In Israel, there's no question that the end of the Cold War really sort of helps to sort of complete the burial of the communists there. I mean, they're basically shunted over to the Arab parties, right? And Jews, for the most part, it's like, okay, no more Soviet Union, because so many Soviet Jews now come to Israel. And that is, I think, a profound effect. So the politics that you see in Israel today, a lot of it reflects the fact that 1 million Soviet Jews roughly emigrated from Russia and came to Israel. And you see it also in American politics too. I mean, the politics of Russian Jews is different from the politics of American Jews. Yeah,
absolutely. Even though the same Ashkenazi roots. Yep. 70 plus years behind the curtain makes a big difference.
It makes for a big difference. That's correct. Yeah.
Another question that came through, obviously, we're talking about Deborah Lipstadt and fighting Holocaust denial. Question about the continuing cause of denial, particularly comment about how President Eisenhower was not present at the time. Upon General Eisenhower seeing Orders required that the residents visit the camp and document what was specifically to preempt denial, and yet denial goes on. And I don't think you're going to answer the universal question as to why denial goes on, but obviously we're still living with this.
Oh yeah. I mean, Eisenhower's decision, it was very important. It was not just about denial. It was because he said, we're told that American soldiers don't know what they're fighting for. At least this way, they'll know what they're fighting against. And that was another piece of it. It was, a lot of American soldiers went to war because they wanted to avenge Pearl Harbor. Right? They didn't go to war because they wanted to fight Nazism. And this was Eisenhower's way of saying, this piece of the battle is really crucial. Yeah. As to, you're right. I mean, why does it go on? It's a form of anti-Semitism, right? I mean, it's...
So these are really interesting questions, I guess, in terms of the broader cultural environment. And, we talk about the different, geography or different identity issues. So here's another one in terms of where did Mizrahi Jews fit in during this era into this landscape, this broad landscape that the volume is presenting?
So they are definitely part of the volume. I didn't choose one of the pieces, that is up, or at least it used to be up on the Posen digital site. If you go to posenlibrary.com, you're taken to a page, and one of the images that we have is of a man holding up 4 pages out of a whole book, which is, the sum history of Mizrahi history in a typical Jewish history textbook, as obviously a real critique. So Mizrahi contributions to culture are very much present in the volume, and it's we're also Nurith especially was very much aware, my co-editor was very much aware of what they were, their contributions to Jewish Israeli culture.
And you address issues in the volume, sort of either differentiate or just to include so-called high culture versus low culture, street culture?
When we talk about culture or Jewish culture, we talk about the different ways in which Jews make culture, right? And they make it through language, and they make it through references, and they make it through reception, and they make it through uses. And, you know, there are a variety of ways. And we don't privilege what you would call high or elite culture, because all of those things, as it were, circulate. We include recipes and food in this. I mean, you can't eat it, obviously, but you could, you know, cook it. We've got a recipe for bagels, and we've got, you know, we're trying to have a very broad understanding of culture. We include children's stories as well, and some examples also of comics, which is a different visual form of culture. The one thing we have real problems with, of course, are performance culture, right? That's very hard to include.
So a really current question,
Okay.
looking at the influence of the pandemic, and, you know, will this alter the trajectory? Obviously, we were asking you to sort of take a little bit of a, you know, a future view, and would you answer that question a little bit differently today in terms of where, particularly, this wouldn't be American, I think international, you know, where how is Jewish culture going to be expressed? Would we see any change because of impact of the pandemic?
So I'm sure we will see changes as a result of the pandemic. I mean, do I know what all those changes will be? Not no. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, and I am a historian, so I'm much better at looking backward than looking forward. But you know, Jews and everybody else who look at what we're doing, right? You're in Cleveland, I assume, right?
Correct.
I happen to be in New York City at the moment, and we're having this conversation about Jewish culture. So some of the classic boundaries that had existed are being erased. And the same, I'm sure, you know, people listening, many of them may have gone to Kol Nidre services, you know, while they're sitting in their home. And that too, the boundary between sacred and profane is being erased through this kind of digital communication. I think it's gonna change. I don't know where it's gonna go, but it has really upset a lot of understandings about how we organize our space and how we deal with relationships, and yeah, and those are
and I would say, you know, from my perspective, the pandemic is a bit of a catalyst on some of these movements that were moving in that direction anyway.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
You know, you talk about the role that digital communication can play in how people are living their lives and expressing their lives, really to move into the cultural realm Jewishly. You know, I can imagine someone, you know, mashing up all the various high holiday services if they can get their hands on the digital copy, and doing something very interesting and very creative with it, because that digital copy will be representative of a huge breadth of types of Jewish expression.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, we included, for example, some very interesting versions of a Haggadah, but compared to what we're doing now, yeah, it would be really, really different. That's correct. Yes.
Interesting question. Last one, just we'll take a few more and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Again, this is on sort of the technology side, but a different sort of technology, genetic testing, and how that can affect Jewish consciousness in the Jewish communities and countries where this is available.
That's really hard. I have a graduate student who's done some really wonderful stuff about genetics and the ways in which not just genetic testing if you're pregnant, but also the sort of fascination with tracing DNA and what, you know, these kinds of things that you can do. where you send your stuff in, right, to be analyzed, and the reveal videos that occur with it, and her analysis, sees this as a really interesting piece of culture that is about identity formation in ways that we normally don't think of identities as being formed that way. So I've not done any of this, but people do come up to me, and what I find fascinating about it, and I don't think this will answer the person's question because it's not about testing, but what I find fascinating is that it often leads people, and I guess this relates also to genealogy, to become more interested in history, right? Because they have suddenly a personal stake in it, in the past. It's their past, and they're interested in where their past sort of leads them.
When I hear you talking about that, it strikes me that, again, those of us in the business, you see these population studies, right? So when they do the population study, they break them into categories: Jews by birth, Jews by religion,
right.
Jews by DNA. I mean, like, could this become a category?
I guess if enough people, tested it, it could become a category. That's why I'm citing my graduate student, Dory Fox. It's like, this is really beyond my expertise. I'm relying on.
So two more questions we've got in the Q&A, and I'll start with the maybe more distressing one first, and then a more optimistic one second.
Okay.
So we can end on a higher note. Question comes in: to what extent does political activism of SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, impact your students' views of American Judaism?
Okay, so that has nothing to do with the Posen
yeah,
library.
it's more of an observation.
I don't ask my students what their politics are. I also don't ask them what their religious affiliation is. I teach a diverse group of students. Sometimes they will tell me what their politics are or what their religion is, but I want them to come to study American Jews and to learn, right, about American Jewish history. So I don't know how to sort of answer that question, because I don't know.
Let me reframe it more in a cultural context.
Okay.
Do you see the political activism, right, more of specifically on the Jewish side of Jewish Voices for Peace, for example, as creating a new realm of Jewish culture ultimately?
Okay, that's a different way of speaking on it. Not yet. No, okay. I don't see it. I mean, I'm thinking back. I remember the late 80s when I was teaching, and you had radical Zionist groups, which were pretty much the same thing. Very pro-peace, very okay. They didn't call themselves SJP, but they were interesting, very bright kids. They were engaged in it in terms of college, and then afterwards, life moved on. I did not see it as leading to a cultural groundswell.
So one final question, and I guess I'm going to reformulate this more in the cultural context. So, you've spoken about some of the changes in Israel in the political sense and also in the cultural sense. What about the transition from Israel, from being, more predominantly viewed as an agricultural nation to that of, startup nation, high-tech nation? And again, how does that find expression in the culture emanating from Israel today?
Well, I think that relates to your question about the end of the Cold War, right? Because the large-scale migration of Soviet Jews, former Soviet Jews, to Israel did have a tremendous impact on the economy. And also an impact in terms of what the ideals of the state should be, right? The agricultural ideals of the state were really early in the formative years, and were by the latter part of the 20th century, it was already changing. I mean, you still had agriculture, of course, and you still do have agriculture, but it was already changing the character, and it has led to really, interesting and different forms of Israeli culture. Since the volume ends in 2005, it doesn't have as much of that registered, to be honest. Yeah.
So there's room for the next volume.
Absolutely, there is, yes.
Deborah, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing the work of the library. And before I turn over to you for some final words, I want to remind everyone that our next session in this series will be October 28th at 4 p.m., which is Voices of Jewish Women with Elishelva Karlbach, followed on November 11th. So we're going to skip a week so everyone can enjoy some election fun. On November 11th, we will have Secularism and Religious Tradition with Todd Endelman and Zvi Gittleman. And then on November 17th, Challenges to the Establishment of Jewish State with David Roskis and Samuel Casso. We are so pleased to be partnering with the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization on this series, and just such a great way to kick it off. I'll turn it back over to you.
So I just wanted to conclude both with a screen share slot to let you see where you can go to actually find some of this material. It's available on print and online. And I also thought that since we haven't had any music, and music is very much part of Jewish culture, that I would leave you with some music, a short video we did. The music is by Alicia Jo Rabins, who's a contemporary composer and performer. And it's called I'm Done Dressing Up for You. And it's about Vashti, who says, no, she's not coming anymore to these banquets. And of course, the fact that she loses her position as queen leads to Esther, the search for becoming queen, and the whole Purim story that evolves from it. So here we go.
Is there a, so you have on here the digital library, and does the
Right.
digital library include music?
It doesn't include recorded versions of music. No, it includes lists of songs and stuff, and other kinds of music, both classical, popular, etc., liturgical, but not recordings, and because it's very difficult to get permission to put these things up. And it's free. It's free, so.
Want to thank our staff here at Siegal Lifelong Learning and at the Posen Library for supporting this presentation. And as I say, we're excited to kick off this way and looking forward to more.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
You too.